This is going to be a rough account of the evolution of Futhorc. So Futhorc proper would have first come into existence probably around the year 500 or maybe 450, somewhere around there. And this is marked by the god rune, I'm going to call it, splitting into a new kind of god rune, an oak rune and an ash rune. But before this happened, some other developments occurred which brought Elder Futhorc closer and closer to the Futhorc forms. So for example, the torch rune and the year rune started taking on full height variant shapes. In Elder Futhorc, the ing rune was often mixed with the ice rune to get the lantern rune bind rune. So it could be that for a while people didn't really feel the need to normalize the ing rune the same way they felt the need to normalize the torch rune and the year rune. In other words, if the only time you see this rune is in this bind rune, where it has a full height, then maybe the rune could have, in theory, survived with a short shape for a while. It's hard to say, though. There aren't that many inscriptions from this particular time and place. But we do know that eventually the rune would take on a shape like this. Some people have proposed that this is an early appearance of that bow tie variant of the ing rune, but some other people think it's just a word divider, and to me it really does just seem to be a word divider. And if you look at it, it doesn't actually have this shape. It's actually more like two squigglies next to each other. We typically think of this as an O rune, but apparently when it was first invented, it was a nasal A, and the old O rune was apparently still making some kind of O sound in very early Futhorc, but eventually it would be affected by mutation and become a kind of sound, and then the nasal A would become a kind of O sound. And by the way, this same development here occurred among North Germanic speakers later on, where the A rune became a nasal rune and eventually became an O rune. So looking at the Chessel down scabbard, besides this older form of the torch rune, we can also see an appearance of the new god rune alongside the, I suppose I'll call it the estate rune. Now, at the time, the sound changes I just mentioned may have not quite occurred yet. So this may have still been a nasal A, and this may have been some kind of O sound, although the fact that there's an ice rune here means that there may have been some kind of mutation already happening on the O sound in this particular context. This rune here is kind of tricky. Now, because the torch rune does appear elsewhere in the inscription, we can determine that this is probably not a variant of the torch rune. So that kind of narrows it down. And so this may be an early appearance of what is called, by some people, the bookhand S rune. So in Futhorc, some people wrote the S rune like this, and some people wrote it like this. And that might be what is appearing here. So when taken all together, the inscription here might say something like Akon Sori or Akon Sori, something like that. I'm not sure when this occurred, but at some point the torch and gift runes gained palatalized sound values in certain contexts, and then later on these offshoot runes were invented to stand for the older unpalatalized values. The double bar variant of the Hail rune seems to have first become popular in and around what is now southern Germany, before it made its way north and into Futhorc. So in the earliest Futhorc, we still find the single bar form. In ancient Mediterranean writing systems, there was a spelling convention where nasal consonant characters didn't always have to be written, and this was inherited into Elder Futhorc, and it still shows up in Futhorc, at least on the mainland. So for example, in this text here, this may be the name Wayland, but there's no N rune here. At some point in England, these runes were invented and stuck at the end of the rune row. Beforehand, they were represented with combinations of runes. So for example, the A diphthong was sometimes represented with the steed rune and the oak rune. In other cases, it was represented with the ash rune and the oak rune. Meanwhile, the sound was supposedly written sometimes with a combination of the aurochs rune and the ice rune. And the thinking is that the aurochs rune and the ice rune were combined into a bind rune, and that this gave birth to the new kind of rune. And meanwhile, some people propose that the other rune, I'm going to call it the earth rune, some people propose that it was invented by taking this bind rune of the steed rune and the oak rune and deleting some of the features, leaving only the earth rune shape. It's hard to say of the two new runes which one is older. Most rune rows put the armament rune, I'm going to call it, earlier in the rune row, but this manuscript is unusual in putting the earth rune earlier. And, you can find some cases, like on the Frank's casket again, where the earth rune does not appear where it could have, but the armament rune does appear. Apparently, the Frisians would not have had much of a use for the earth rune because the diphthong it stood for came from a Proto-Germanic diphthong, something like aw, and this became something like ah in Frisian, so just the long ah sound. So that's why scholars think that this coin is Frisian, because if you look here, it says scan, where in English it would probably say something like shaun. Although the elk rune, I'm going to call it, used to make a kind of Z sound in Proto-Germanic, by the year 500 or so in Anglo-Frisian language, that sound had gone away. It had merged into other sounds. So it's hard to say what use this rune would have had in the earliest kind of Futhorc, but we do see later on that it was associated with the Latin letter X. Even in the earliest texts, the U rune seems to have been redundant, standing for the same sound as the ice rune. But at some point in England, it seems like someone decided to repurpose the rune and use it for a kind of h or ch sound. I've seen it proposed that these sounds were associated with the rune all the way back in Elder Futhorc times, but I haven't seen any clear examples of that.